You never learn to leave a bullet or a scar. We're swimming with the sharks again.
Could we do a Kickstarter to save up funds to buy the rights for D4?
Oh, hello everyone. I'm Hikiko, and welcome to SWERY Files, Episode 3, Dark Dreams Don't Die. This is the story about a man with a very strange fate. And by man, I mean SWERY65, as this game almost ended his career in the video games industry. That and some undiagnosed health issues at the time, and some drama behind the scenes, but we're not going to get into all of that right now. What can I say? I've had a hard time letting go of D4. It's one of the games that I felt had the most potential to drive SWERY's career into the mainstream due to its unique and interesting twist on the narrative-driven adventure genre. D4 is a game that is near and dear to my heart, as I got my start on this channel talking about D4 and all the surrounding drama, as well as reviewing the game very early on in my channel. And it's just been one of those games that has been stuck in the back of my mind, just with these questions of what happened during D4? Like, why? What was the great mystery? Who killed Little Peggy? What was it all about? Well, tonight, I hope I can answer all these lingering questions. Guys, I hope you brought your stream snacks and your beverage of choice, because we're in for a long one. I got mine right here. It even starts with the letter D. That's right, SWERY Files, Episode 3, Dark Dreams Don't Die begins now. Let's dive into the past.
In the same year as the release of Deadly Premonition, Microsoft produced the Kinect, a modular motion sensing camera that was set to take the gaming world by storm with the promise of freeing the player from the controller. Another case of a solution seeking a problem. Now, the Kinect that was released lacked many of the features promised in the Project Natal pitch.
You know, Kinect, I'll be honest, it was a disaster. It was a disaster, right? It was a train wreck. It started as this device which kind of could do everything itself.
Yeah.
It didn't take up any processor power. The field of view was you know, could encompass the whole room.
Right.
The audio on it, which no one really talks about, was originally supposed to be, you know, multi-sensing. It could sense where you were as you walked across the room.
Yeah.
It ended up being none of those things.
Its technical shortcomings didn't seem to matter because people bought the Kinect in droves anyway, myself included. I attribute the success due to the awareness of the product, and with an estimated marketing budget of over $500 million and appearances on prominent mainstream television, it's no wonder that it sold over 8 million units at launch. The success of the Kinect planted a red seed in the mind of SWERY, and he found great potential in the device for a future game. I've had the concept in my head since 2010. When we released Deadly Premonition, I wanted to create a game that allowed players to really slip into a world and follow the stories of the characters while experiencing things with them. I always strive to create game mechanics, stories, and settings that blur the line between games and the real world. And when I saw the Kinect hardware, I knew it was the missing piece to my puzzle. Like Deadly Premonition before it, the prototype went through many trials and tribulations and even a cancellation during its development. The concept for the game had a focus on two core philosophies: character empathy, and sensory replication. SWERY believed that players would build an emotional bond with the characters by placing the player in a more active role in the story by having them replicate the action of the scenes laid out before them. The team used everyday tasks as a guide for their proof of concept. For example, SWERY would take actions like opening a door or turning a faucet as a frame of reference and then break them down into simple steps, and then he would attempt to replicate those movements in the game engine. SWERY found that the gesture controls were growing more and more complicated and tiresome for the player to perform for long periods of time. The initial concept had players getting up from their chairs and moving their feet to take steps forward in the game. SWERY concluded that a complex gesture system would only set to frustrate the players over time and would risk taking away focus from the story, thus compromising the player's investment in the world and characters. So the team went back to the basics and focused on simplifying the gestures. For the prototype of D4, they built an open room with a variety of objects to observe or interact with in hopes of refining the motion controls. Here you can see a prototype of David Young staring at a Deadly Premonition poster. And here's a different angle of the room where we can see David sitting around on a couch and Willie from DP making a cameo off on the left. There's an arrow on the ground that is guiding the player towards a prototype Amanda who's across the room and sitting next to a spy fiction poster. And turning the camera 180 degrees, we get another vantage of the room with a Deadly Spawn poster and what looks like to be Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Perhaps Proto David was also a cinephile like York. In this screenshot, we are given a look at an interactive segment where David is using a sink. Up top is the time limit for the action, and below is a visual guide for the player. In this next screen, we can see that the steam from the hot water caused the mirror above to fog up, so a prompt is given to clean the mirror. By the way, this wiping action did carry over into the final game, as David has to wipe this window and this dirty-ass fuse box. This photo here demonstrates an action scene where David draws his gun at a shadowy figure. One thing to note, the prompt here expects the player to use two hands to pantomime a gun in a Serial Experiments Lane fashion. There's never a shooting QTE implemented into D4 Season 1, but David does acquire a gun at the end of it, so this segment could have potentially carried over. Axis had gotten rather far into the 360 build of the game as the airplane level was beginning to take shape. Here's the bathroom mirror where we get a clear look at Proto David's face. Here's David staring down Francis York Morgan, although I think this was more of a placeholder character and not in an attempt to bridge the two stories together, although they would eventually become bridged at one point. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. The rest of these screenshots are concept art for the original D4. Some of the elements from the concept art were clearly retained in the final game. For example, David and Peggy's relationship, David's broken watch, ice hockey, and what seems to be drugs and clover-shaped pills. Could this be real blood? Sometime in 2012, Axis Games decided to cancel the Xbox 360 version in favor of restarting development on the Xbox One. The game went through a total graphical overhaul, where character models and locations were redesigned from the ground up, perhaps for potential copyright reasons in the former. Remember everyone, it's just a coincidence.
D4 on the Xbox 360 had to be canceled in favor of shifting development over to the new generation of consoles, the Xbox One, and the Kinect 2.0 and all the improved features that this offered over the original.
In May of 2013, Microsoft debuted the Xbox One, and the Kinect 2.0 was integral to the ecosystem of the platform. So much so that it was a mandatory accessory included with every Xbox One system sold at launch. Microsoft was so serious about their Kinect commitment that it was built into the OS, and the system would not operate unless a Kinect was plugged in at all times.
Now I can't blame Access Games' strategy here. It was a smart business move considering that every Xbox One sold came with a Kinect. So you already have an install base at launch. And hey, guess what? we're developing an exclusive Kinect game, so it's already an attractive business proposition to offer to Microsoft. Well, the strategy paid off, and Microsoft funded Dark Dreams Don't Die. Wow, a Japanese game developer and Microsoft coming together to form a business relationship during the Xbox One's generation. What could possibly go wrong?
The Xbox One was headed down a path of destruction, with the executive face of the brand, Don Mattrick, publicly defending the anti-consumer practices of always-on digital rights management and mandatory Kinect adoption.
There's no choices about is Kinect in or out. Right. Kinect is in. You're going to be able to use that for voice commands, for gesture, in conjunction with the controller, right. In conjunction with Smart Glass. Mm-hmm. That's huge as a creator.
This terrible reading of the marketplace had opened a window of opportunity for Sony to dunk on Microsoft by undercutting the price of the Xbox One by $100 and quickly putting out a video mocking the Xbox One's inability to share games.
This is how you share your games on PS4. Thanks.
Right after the big reveal of Quantum Break, D4 was unceremoniously unveiled with a trailer showing off a rough-looking early build of the game. The trailer did not explain any important details about what gamers could expect beyond it was a mystery Kinect game made by SWERY 65. Problem was, most people didn't know who SWERY was, and this trailer would become the only major promotion Microsoft would ever afford the game.
D4, another example of our commitment to working with developers all around the world. It's wonderful to welcome SWERY 65 and his team to Xbox One.
Perhaps the largest blow dealt to D4 came on June 9th of 2014, just a few months shy of its release date. Due to the abysmal reputation of the Xbox brand,
I think people are imagining outcomes that are worse than what we believe it's going to be in the real world.
Right.
Don Mattrick resigned and was replaced by Phil Spencer, who became the head of Xbox. Phil Spencer made some quick moves to address gamers' issues with the Xbox One. Primarily, the price point of $499 had to go, and the quickest way to drop that price was to uncouple the Kinect from the system and sell it separately, thus allowing the Xbox One to be sold at a new $399 SKU. In retrospect, removing the mandatory Kinect was a smart move on Microsoft's behalf, but not without its casualties. D4 was caught in the undertow. When I heard the Kinect wasn't going to be bundled with the system anymore, honestly, I was disappointed.
Keep in mind, this was 3 months away from D4's launch, and it was nowhere to be found at the press conference. Well, unless you count 5 total seconds and a scissor reel of all the games that were coming out to the Xbox One. 5 total seconds is all D4 got, and it didn't explain anything, not even a price point or a launch date. Let me ask you something here. Would it have really killed Microsoft to, I don't know, shave 15 seconds off the Project Spark trailer just to come out on the stage and say, hey, speaking of Kinect, we have this brand new mystery adventure game, Dark Dreams Don't Die. It releases in a few months. You can play it with a controller, but it's better with Kinect. Roll the trailer!
D4 made one final appearance at the 2014 Tokyo Game Show, where SWERY had a tiny booth in the Microsoft area to demonstrate the game to Japanese players, who most likely did not own an Xbox One and had no plans of getting one.
Dark Dreams Don't Die would make one final appearance before its sudden launch at 2014's Tokyo Game Show. And I'm still not sure who let SWERY do this, but SWERY had it in his head that a surprise reveal would be a good thing, for the reason of, and I quote, "I wanted to do it like Steve Jobs." Play the clip.
This is SWERY, creator of Deadly Premonition and D4, by the way.
Did you hear about D4 release date? Like Steve Jobs.
Yeah, it's Steve Jobs. One more thing.
Yeah, one more thing.
One more thing.
Yeah, release date is tomorrow.
D4 was suddenly released on September 19th of 2014 on the Xbox Live Marketplace. To everyone's surprise, no one knew the game had come out. Not even SWERY's close friends were aware that this game was out. And I just so happened to stumble upon the news. I panicked and I went out and I bought an Xbox One and Kinect at a secondhand store because do it for SWERY. And to no one's surprise, it sold like shit.
According to this old NeoGAF thread, 1 week after the release of D4, there were only 10,000 users on the Xbox leaderboards that had purchased the game. When asked on Twitter if SWERY was satisfied with the sales, he replied, "No, not enough, sad face, and please someone help."
Quite frankly, I don't think it was the game's fault, because the game's quality was great. It was fun, the soundtrack was incredible, visually appealing, the story was intriguing, and it was one of the best Kinect experiences that I've ever had. I think it truly used all the features of the Kinect 2.0. Unfortunately, no one knew it existed. I'm gonna be upfront with you guys. I'm probably biased in my perspective on what happened to D4, as I truly think it's a tragedy and I love the game dearly. And unfortunately, my perspective is not good enough on its own to be trusted. So we're gonna need to dive back into the past and seek out a trusted, professional source of video game coverage. A time capsule, if you will, preserved in the ether of YouTube that perfectly demonstrates the public consciousness in reaction to the launch of D4. Thankfully, I have uncovered this archive, and we're about to open that time capsule right here and right now. Dive.
D4 Dark Dreams Don't Die. What an interesting story this game has. It's a Xbox One exclusive. It is an episodic game from the mind of SWERY, and I forget what, no, I think it's 65 or something like that. SWERY is a game designer. Finally, the game is being released on Xbox One, and the weirdest thing is that it is a Kinect game, but I am not using the Kinect. I know a lot of people, oh, why aren't you using the Kinect? It's pretty simple, all right? Pretty simple. Number one, I hate the Kinect. Number two, the game doesn't need the Kinect. The game actually works with a controller anyway. So why would I hinder my gameplay experience, you know, with stupid Kinect controls? I just think it's really weird that they decided to do that. Then again, SWERY is a pretty weird guy, so I'm not very surprised. The thing that's the weirdest about this game is that it's Kinect, right? But just a couple months ago, they started selling the Xbox One without the Kinect, and chances are tons of people bought it without it because they were waiting to get it without the Kinect. So tons of people just bought their Xbox One and oh, a brand new Kinect game just came out. Like, what?
Despite the depressing sales numbers of D4, there was still one fraction, a sliver of hope left for this franchise. And that came after fans reached out to Phil Spencer, the head of Xbox, on Twitter and asked him, begged him to save this franchise. To which Phil replied, "We're working on plans to promote D4 more. Great support from the community is key. Thanks for that." 3 months after Phil Spencer's tweet and 4 months after D4's release, D4 was released as part of Xbox's Games with Gold program. It got 1.3 million downloads. Success! D4 is saved, right? Oh no. There's something you have to understand about Games with Gold and PlayStation Plus and all the other subscription services that offer free games. Now, the contracts aren't fully transparent for the public to see, but it's commonly understood that when a game enters Games with Gold or PlayStation Plus, the developers of said game are often paid a lump sum up front for that contracted period. So like the window in which that game is available through that service. So usually a month, right? So does that mean that Access Games got additional money on top of that? No. Unfortunately, the Games with Gold program ended up becoming a case of trading profit for exposure. Well, the game got enough eyes on it, I guess, but it still wasn't enough to fund D4 Season 2. So despite all the drama that ensued afterwards, after the PC release and SWERY's retirement from the industry, none of that mattered because there was no money there to fund D4 Season 2. That's the unfortunate truth.
Do you think the past can be changed?
Dark Dreams Don't Die is a detective murder mystery. In total, there are 3 episodes of Season 1. Episode 0, the Prologue, Episode 1, and Episode 2. But Access was in development of a second season, and after I dug through the textures of the PC version, I found these placeholder DDS files which suggest that they had planned the game up until Season 2, Episode 3, totaling 6 episodes for David Young's story. But the game wouldn't stop there, as SWERY had a vision of making D4 a long-running series that would continue well after the conclusion of the main story, that is, if the game found success.
If it gets popular, I'd be willing to put out 100 or 200. Just depends on how much people like it.
This is a story of a man with a very strange fate.
Hey, look. It's like I've grown wings.
Episode 0, The Day It All Began, is our prologue, and it places us in the role of a young girl, who we later learn is Little Peggy Oldmann. The icy lake acts as a tutorial, where we get a rundown of the controls. The hand on the screen acts as the game's cursor. This isn't your typical cursor, as you're capable of pushing objects in the game world, as well as interacting with them in a variety of different ways. This is one of the most detail-oriented games I've ever experienced. For example, if you hover the cursor over an object for a little bit, descriptions of the objects pop out, and they're written from the character's perspective. Every object in the game is loaded to the brim with little details, all of which were painstakingly written by SWERY himself, and there's well over 700 of these tucked away in the game. Peggy's unnamed father waves her on as she treks across the lake to pet a mysterious white owl on the other side. As she reaches out towards the owl, it's startled and flies off. The ice then cracks beneath Peggy's feet, and her father rushes towards her. This seems rather insignificant to the overall plot at first, but I will clarify its importance later. The main story follows that of David Young. Hey, that sounds familiar.
FBI Special Agent David Young Henning.
A private eye and former knock for the Boston PD. As he's descending into a bathtub whilst blowing a bubble and holding a high heel. Allegedly, David has the power to travel through time and change the past. But that's all predicated on whether or not you find David to be a reliable narrator or not. And since we're dealing with a SWERY game story, reliable narrators aren't all too common. The high heel thing is linked to his time travel ability, which is activated when he comes into possession of a Memento object, which is an object that connects him to the past. David has been fruitlessly searching for the murderer of his wife, Little Peggy, after a fateful day 2 years prior when she was murdered in their bathroom, and David was shot in the head, which afflicted him with retrograde amnesia.
My symptoms are what's known as retrograde amnesia. It means I have holes in my memory prior to the incident. I'm kinda like a drunk who's chosen to just forget the bad stuff.
meaning that he cannot remember the events surrounding the night of the murder, with the sole exception of his wife's dying words, "Look for D." And that's enough to send him off on his quest to pursue the elusive D. Just observing his bathroom, you can see that David had been searching tirelessly for D, as it's littered with mementos of all kinds. Blink and you'll miss it, but there's also a nice little nod to Deadly Premonition with a bag of red seeds placed in the bathtub. We exit the bathroom to David's apartment, where there's a ton of objects to observe and interact with. As a player, we live vicariously through the character of David Young, walking in his shoes and occupying a place in his fragmented consciousness. We listen to his inner observations and physically pantomime his interactions with the world.
A Nobel Prize for the first man who put cheese in a hamburger.
This is all part of SWERY's grand design, character empathy through sensory replication. The game is structured around a sync mechanic. It's a reward system based on how well you pantomime David's actions on the screen. It makes a tad more sense design-wise if you play with the Kinect, as it's supposed to measure how in sync your body is with the avatar of David Young. Otherwise, it just rewards you with money and points for completing the QTEs with quick enough accuracy. To help the player understand what David can interact with in the world, the developers put in a special vision ability which highlights all the interactive objects on the field. But it has a limited amount of uses that can only be replenished by #DrainKing.
Good tequila, don't freeze.
Only 100% agave tequila.
Yeah.
All this movement and interaction does come at a stamina cost, so you've got to go around and eat the things you see in front of you. Personally, I love this system. The game keeps track of all the food you've eaten, the calories you've consumed, and provides a list of everything you've eaten in the game. But if you're not a fan of these systems, you can always go over to David's closet and swap out a costume, all of which will modify his look and attributes in an RPG-light fashion. There's clothing in there for just about any taste, and if you're a fan of SWERY's prior work, you might recognize some of these costumes. Many players unfamiliar with his work may see all these little details as extraneous, but SWERY would counter that argument by stating that the unnecessary is necessary.
So not only putting things that are necessary, but if you incorporate things that are unnecessary, the little quirks in life, it becomes a little bit better, a deeper world view than just having things that are necessary on the screen. So in order to have empathy or emotional content, you need to have these unnecessary aspects to create a more real universe.
In a fortune cookie, I began to understand what SWERY was going for after the first time I slammed down a tequila shot as David Young. It's one of those experiences that you just don't get until you've done it yourself.
Food list. Slam it. Pretty cool.
Alright, back to the story. So David has a binder with evidence relating to Little Peggy's murder. The key takeaways from this are: 1. There's a drug known as real blood that was detected in her body. 2. A large amount of her blood was drained out of her. And 3, and the most important detail, there were no traces of a third party, meaning that only David and Peggy's DNA were found at the scene of the murder. These details will become very important later on, so don't forget them.
I'll do everything in my power to find this D. I swear I will. And when I do, oh, Peggy.
David hears a rattling at his balcony door. He opens it and he's ambushed by Amanda, a mysterious girl with the mannerisms of a cat. This is our first action scene, and I think it conveys the comedy of D4 effectively. D4 parodies the QuickTime events trope found in most modern adventure games. The game rewards you with credits for acting out the ridiculous scenes, but if you do fail the prompts, your punishment is the laughter that comes from the failure. For example, you miss catching the mouse with your hand and it goes straight into David's mouth, prompting him to vomit. For the most part, the QTEs in D4 are not designed to be punishing, and they still carry the scene forward regardless of the player's inaccuracies. Alright, so Amanda here is presented as a mysterious girl that lives in the apartment and does the shopping for David, as David's somewhat agoraphobic. She also acts as the game's merchant, where you can purchase things like food, medical supplies, costumes, and music. You can also buy her gifts and build up your relationship, which provides you with discounts in the shop. I'll explain who she really is later on. In strolls Forrest Teddy Kaysen. No relation. Teddy is David's former partner and current head of the Boston Police Department's Narcotics Task Force. He provides David with evidence relating to D. Now ask yourself, why would this powerful head of a narcotics task force just hand over information to a private eye that was directly involved in a drug-related murder? By the way, I noticed something about this scene. If you open the fridge before Kaysen's arrival, you'll notice that it's quite disorganized and messy. Moments later, Teddy arrives and starts cleaning up David's fridge during this dialogue cutscene. Now, if you check the refrigerator afterwards, everything's now organized. This detail is never explicitly pointed out to the player, and who the hell would care about something like this? But damn, if it doesn't describe the dynamics of David and Teddy's relationship. Teddy is always cleaning up David's messes. Teddy brings up the accident involving AG Flight 117, which was struck by lightning, and Teddy believes it is connected to D.
We might be looking at the real deal. I've got the good stuff for you this time.
Cue that beautiful title card sequence. Alright, so here's the rundown. A drug courier by the name of Anthony Rabbit Zapatero was in custody on that plane, but he vanished from the flight. Zapatero was gonna give up information about his supplier of real blood, whose name allegedly starts with the letter D. Whether or not Teddy's evidence is related to David's D matters little, as the possibility of it being any D at all is the only motivation David needs to get on this case.
So, interested yet? Let me ask you again. A passenger simply vanishing from an aircraft mid-flight. Does that sound possible to you?
David is given a bloody badge, which belonged to Federal Marshal Derek Buchanan, who was killed on AG Flight 117 during the transport of the courier. This badge acts as a memento, allowing David to dive into the scene of the crime. After this cutscene, some optional content unlocks. You can choose to eat a meal with Teddy and Amanda, which does lead to some interesting conversations about food and murder. You know, standard fare shit for SWERY games.
He sawed their heads off from the neck and took them back to his house. He cleaned the skulls up and used them as utensils in his daily life, to eat from or as a urine cup. He hated women. That was his way of dealing with it.
These meal scenes get gradually more horrific as the game goes along, and you see Kaysen gorge himself with massive amounts of food. In an interview, SWERY offhandedly mentioned that he was pressured by the upper management to include more meme-like moments in the game, possibly in hopes of hitting the same beats of Deadly Premonition, so the game would go viral.
Just shut the fuck up and make memes. Memes are the secret to making profits grow.
Anywhere I end up at, it's all the fucking same. The best I can hope for is that somebody will enjoy my games on an ironic level and make a low-effort Let's Play that caters to children. But does anyone care how SWERY feels?
David approaches the bathroom and thanks Teddy for his help, and Teddy mentions that if he hadn't asked David to join the force in the first place, but then he's quickly cut off by David before he could finish his thought. I believe the rest of the sentence was going to be, your wife would have never been murdered, but it's left unsaid. Teddy seems to express his own guilt for how David's life turned out, and his next couple of lines might ring a familiar bell.
Don't give me that look, Amanda. I'm just trying to give him a reason to live.
David grabs the marshal's badge and dives into the past, and thus the prologue concludes.
Before we get into the next episode, I've got a question for you. Does D4 story sound familiar? Well, if you watch enough movies like I do, and SWERY obviously does, then you might be accusing him right now of some parallel thinking. Possibly lifting some aspects from Christopher Nolan's Memento. Don't believe me? Here you go. Memento is a story about Leonard, a man on the hunt for the person who murdered his wife in the bathroom of their home. During the crime, Leonard was attacked and his head was shoved into a mirror, which broke both the mirror and his mind. Instead of retrograde amnesia, Leonard has no short-term memory, and he leaves himself mementos in the form of Polaroid pictures or tattoos on his body to remind him of his main objective of finding John G. Look for John G. He's also assisted by an undercover narcotics agent by the name of Teddy, who has his own ulterior motives for wanting to help Leonard. Maybe this line might sound familiar.
Look how happy you are. I wanted to see that face again.
Oh, gee, thanks.
Fuck you. I gave you a reason to live.
Don't give me that look, Amanda. I'm just trying to give him a reason to live.
SWERY just keeps tiptoeing closer and closer to the line of copyright infringement. One day, he's gonna step too far over into the land of lawsuits. Oh well, I can't be mad at him, and I love him all the same.
Episode 1, Gordian Knot. David dives a couple of days into the past, May 12th of 2013, and he ends up in the lavatory of AG Flight 117, headed to Boston. His nose conspicuously bleeds just after. His objective is to locate the drug courier and uncover how he mysteriously vanished. On his way out of the bathroom, David bumps into a stewardess and briefly projects the image of Little Peggy onto her.
David.
Little Peggy? This is Olivia Jones. Olivia notices David is not on the passenger list, and this raises her suspicion. Before he's questioned further, David wanders over to where Derek, the federal marshal who will be murdered, and Zapatero, the drug courier, are sitting.
A dealer of the drug called Real Blood. Apparently, he also has evidence that could lead to the identity of D. If that's true, it makes him the most important person on this flight.
Derek is already familiar with David, even though David does not remember the past in which he and Derek have met. David snatches a bent fountain pen and warns Derek that he's gonna die today.
I'll keep the fountain pen to remember you by.
Now, if you dive back into David's apartment, you'll learn from Teddy that not only did Derek die and Anthony disappear, but a mysterious John Doe's body was found on the plane.
People died during this one, including a John Doe. Just the kind of incident that airlines tend to keep mum.
Could the John Doe be the courier?
Nope.
You're positive?
Yep. The DNA samples don't match. We took some when he was arrested.
Fair enough.
Back on the plane, David meets an object sexual fashion designer, Duncan, and his partner slash mannequin, Suki. They aren't plot critical, but they are worth pointing out for the hilarity of the situation.
This is avant-garde.
Moving down the aisle, David meets Deborah Anderson, a person that obsessively documents details in her daily life. She tries to warn David about an impending crash of the plane, but David assures her that the flight will not crash.
This plane is going down!
No, this plane didn't crash.
This questioning of her judgment causes her to flip out and call the attention of Philip Cheney, a rather large and muscular flight attendant. Philip also seems to be familiar with David. By the way, his introduction seems to be another homage to Leon the Professional.
You are quite the stubborn mule.
Philip expresses his disdain for David and threatens to eject him from the game, should he cause trouble, which is a reference to a match penalty in hockey. This detail seems rather unimportant, but just keep it in your pocket for later. To continue his investigation, David must look for a way to distract Philip so that he can get further into the plane. So David just starts making a bunch of noise, which sets Deborah off.
What? Are you saying these window noises are all in my head? Are you? Dumb fuck!
And to calm her down, Philip escorts her to business class as a giant surgeon holding a fork and knife lurches out of the curtains and blocks the way forward.
What the fuck?
Upon sight of the tall man, David's scar begins to throb, and he believes they have met. But before he can figure it out, the plane is struck by lightning, which gives Zapatero an opportunity to brutally assault the marshal. This brings us to the confrontation between David and Zapatero, which is the most iconic action sequence in the game. This is underscored by an Irish rock song called Drank Dom Dead Die. And if the tune sounds familiar, it's because it's another, quote, homage to The Departed's theme song, I'm Shipping Up to Boston by the Dropkick Murphys. This wild man has no shame sometimes, but I love him all the same. Once again, this action scene is better appreciated when you're playing it with a Kinect, as it contains some hilarious pantomiming. The first is when it prompts the player to take a batting stance with Suki's leg and hit a baseball to knock out Zapatero's fake eye.
No hitting back at the pitcher.
The second is when David picks up a megaphone and then the player is prompted to shout loudly into his face, then slap the shit out of him with the megaphone. I'm gonna be honest with you, I absolutely love these moments, and it's a shame that there's only 4 major ones contained within the game. It's a knockdown, drag-out, slobber knocker of a fight, and I think the brutality of the scene demonstrates how desperate David is to find Dee by any means necessary. The fight catches the attention of Olivia, who then draws a gun on David, revealing herself to be some sort of undercover agent. But before she can arrest him, AG-117 is struck by another bolt of lightning, and the screen flashes to white. David opens his eyes to see both Olivia and the courier have vanished.
The courier, he vanished?
As he investigates the scene, he finds Derek sitting alone, and the marshal doesn't seem to recognize David.
But that's a surprise. You're the last person I'd expect to be carrying a picture of your family.
Listen up. I don't know who you are. But if you want to keep sucking down air, never talk to me again.
David then asks Philip what happened to Olivia, and not only does Philip not recognize him, but he reveals that Olivia is not on this flight. Then Philip reveals that this plane is headed to Ronald Reagan International Airport in Washington, D.C. Still confused about his current predicament, he decides to ask the slow-talking giant from before, who's revealed to be Roland Walken, about what happened to the flight attendant.
If time changes, so too does place.
The giant seems to know David and tells him they met on a wintry night. He also tells David that clovers represent his memories of Peggy. And here you participate in a game of Clover Touch, where you have to move the cursor around and collect all these clovers before they hit the bottom of the screen. If you achieve the high score on this game, Roland drops letters from Little Peggy at David's apartment. The letters from Peggy will become critical keys to understanding D4's greatest mysteries, and we will return to them later. If you choose to speak with Deborah and complete all of her mini-games, she will also reveal that she's a nurse for a hospital in Boston. She mentions a record snowfall on the date of January 26, 2011, which just so happens to be the night Little Peggy was murdered. On that night, there was an emergency case at the hospital. Her notes read, "Emergency patient, unstable, unsafe, gunshot emergency surgery, operated by Dr. R.W. Success." What could the R.W. stand for?
This big fella, I've met him before somewhere, but I can't remember where.
David finally pieces together that this plane is not AG-117 bound for Boston. When the lightning struck, he dove further into the past, and this plane is headed southbound for Washington, D.C., where Derek is on his way to retrieve Anthony Zapatero.
What are you rambling about?
The destination is in the other direction.
This whole episode just establishes how David met all the passengers on the flight, and it does little to advance the plot any further. That is until David is suddenly tased inside the lavatory, and before he passes out, he finds a broken eyeglass lens that belonged to his attacker. This episode's cliffhanger is quite the interesting one, as the scene shifts back to the present day, in the hallway outside of David's apartment. This is somewhat of an unofficial canon thing, but it is worth mentioning. David's apartment is located on the top floor of Zack from Deadly Premonition 2's building, only here it's blocked off by this sign. As for the connection between DP2 and D4, I'll get to that later. The camera lingers for a moment on the excessive empty bottles of liquor, and then a foot comes into frame. A mysterious man carrying a stack of books walks into frame. The top book reads, "Atlas of Blood Blank Diseases." Well, I had to know what that meant, so I went into the game's files and found this texture, Atlas of Bloodborne Diseases. This white-haired man is also wearing a white owl feather in his coat. Where did he get a white owl feather? He knocks on the door and Teddy opens it with a look of concern on his face. And that's our cliffhanger. Episode 2, The Fourth Suspect, is the final episode of Season 1 and by extension, D4. We return to the icy lake, where David is passed out underneath the White Owl. He wakes to find the little girl from the prologue, who asks him who he is. He tells her that he is David Young, and the girl is surprised by this, as she has heard about him from some unknown source.
You're David? There's a spot-billed duck with her duckling over there. Let's play with them.
Speaking with the girl, David discovers that she had almost died on this very lake when the ice began to crack, referencing the prologue. But before she died, her two dads saved her.
But my two dads saved me. My two wonderful dads.
Two dads. I only counted the one. David clears off the bench and sits down. The girl asks him what he's doing here, and he says he's looking for a lead that will help him meet someone special one more time. She asks him what he'll do once he finds it, and he states he will change the past. Visions of Little Peggy arrive and reinforce the notion that you can't change the past, and begs David to accept her death.
I'm going to change it.
Time is always moving into the future. It's always been that way.
But
you can't change the past. You just have to accept it. I belong to the past. I'm dead, David.
No!
I am dead. I am dead. I'm dead. I'm dead. I am dead. I'm dead. I'm dead. I am dead.
Once again, he awakens alone in his bathroom. Exiting, he notices he still has the broken glass from the attacker, whom he now suspects to be Derek Buchanan. In an optional but critical cutscene, David looks at his evidence book, and there's a newspaper clipping from the Boston Times that reads, "Thompsonville apartment murder, initially discovered by victim's father." Hey, remember this guy? This is Dr. Oldmann, Peggy's second father, and the one that raised her. We learn that his hair turned white out of the shock of discovering her dead body.
The shock was so great, it turned his hair white overnight.
Oh, nosy dotes and little lambsy divey, a kiddly divey too, wouldn't you?
Uncle Evan's hair turned white.
Here are the key takeaways from this moment. 1. August was the first person at the crime scene. 2. David was not there when he arrived because someone had secretly taken him to the hospital. David flashes back to a conversation he had with Oldman just after the murder. And August's voice is intentionally distorted so the player cannot learn of his true identity.
David Young, do you think the past can be changed?
David notices that Teddy has conveniently left a file about murders related to the drug Real Blood. In this file, David sees horrific images of the victims that were murdered, and they had some involvement with the drug Real Blood, one of which was Little Peggy. David then guesses Teddy's password and logs in to find that Teddy has been using geographical profiling to connect all the areas in the city where the bodies were found.
BPD, the hockey rink, Diana's cafe, the Oldman Clinical Research Lab, this apartment, and the house Little Peggy grew up in.
Note, all these areas are linked to David, Teddy, and August Oldman. David falls asleep and he's awakened by another vision of Peggy, who's actually just Teddy.
Morning, Little Peggy.
Good morning, David.
David suspects someone was in the apartment the night before and presses Teddy on this issue. Teddy admits that he had an informant stop by, but it's totally unrelated, and then quickly changes the subject back to the case of the missing courier. David notices that Amanda is playing with a ragged old baseball. He picks it up and realizes that it's a memento linked to Zapatero.
Whoa! Amanda?
After a quick action sequence with Amanda, David barely manages to retrieve the ball. Teddy is confused as he did not remember placing the ball in his evidence box. This convinces David that he was able to change the past. Teddy quickly rebukes this claim.
You can't change the past. Facing the past changes your perception of it. This memento, it's the same. You didn't change the past. Just how you perceive
Teddy, you always help me out. Thanks, partner.
Hey, David!
Unfazed, David dives back to May 12th, 2013, but this time in the cargo hold of AG-117. He lands on top of Olivia Jones, who then points a gun at David and reveals herself to be a DEA agent. She gets a call from Delta, her partner, who states that he's been disarmed by Derek Buchanan, who is now moving the courier to the front of the cargo hold.
The marshal's moving the courier, and we need to get up there.
I said don't move!
Olivia twists her ankle during some turbulence, and the camera lingers on her stiletto heel. And David offers his shoulder and notices her strong resemblance to the dead wife. Talking with Olivia, she mentions how her partner Delta had arrested many real blood users during his DEA work. A user once said to him that real blood can awaken special powers. Olivia suggests that perhaps a powerful user of real blood is responsible for all the mangled corpses, and she reinforces that real blood is different from all the rest of the drugs.
But that word, he didn't say talents or sensations. He said powers, special powers. Those words just stuck with me. Maybe they have some connection to those bizarre corpses.
Looking around, David discovers evidence of a skirmish leading up to the front of the plane, and a shadowy giant with a glowing red eye is staring him down. David pursues the figure, but Olivia stops him to reveal that he reminds her of a real blood case where a former detective was suspected of murdering his wife. Then David hallucinates a vision of Little Peggy with a gunshot wound. He tells Olivia that he did not murder his wife, but Olivia still tries to arrest him. But before she can, a surge of electricity melts the door between them, and she drops her gun on David's side. David performs the final action scene as he's running to reach the front of the cargo hold before the shutter closes. He barely makes it in, only to be greeted by the giant Roland. The giant remarks that David looks dreadful, just like back when he was an undercover narcotics agent. Also note that David's nose begins to bleed when Roland mentions this.
That's in the past.
Roland awkwardly squeezes himself into a vent, and David presses him about his true identity. Here's the key information. Only David can see Roland, which is more or less a confirmation of David's delusions, either brought on by the bullet or his former real blood use. David presses further into the plane to discover the Marshal's bloody jacket and pieces together that Derek kidnapped Zapatero. His hunch is confirmed when he arrives on the scene where Derek is beating the absolute shit out of Zapatero and demanding he reveal his boss. David tells Derek that he understands why he's after Zapatero. The Marshal is trying to wipe out everyone involved with real blood to avenge his family, who were murdered by a real blood user. Ironically enough, David tells Derek to give up on revenge because none of it will bring back his family. Derek is less than amused by this proposition.
Don't you fuck with me! Change the past! Who's gonna believe that bullshit?
And he tells David if he wants the evidence, which is Zapatero's eye, then he'll have to come take it by force. Before they scuffle, David notices a strange electrical current affecting his watch. He turns around and dodges a live wire, which then impales the Marshal, killing him on the spot. Then a mysterious giant lurches out of the darkness with a knocked out Olivia in his grasp. It then dawns on David that codename Delta was Philip Cheney, aka the 4th D. Notice the missing lens.
Mr. David Young.
A hulked out Philip Cheney lunges at David, and David draws his gun in return. Freeze frame, to be continued. Duh.
What a fucking ending. Holy shit. Did this game just go into fucking apeshit anime mode? That is a perfect cliffhanger ending to an anime episode right there.
SWERY has one more cliffhanger in store for us. The forever cliffhanger. We get one last look at the frozen lake, now thawed. In the present day, Teddy is sitting on the bench from before, where he is visited by Dr. Oldmann. And this time we're given a profile shot of his face and learn that he's Little Peggy's foster father. Not biological father, not stepfather, foster father. I wonder what happened to our biological father.
That thing we discussed.
I've arranged it, just like you wanted. Now will you be able to meet my expectations?
Teddy ponderously looks out towards the lake, and that's the end.
Woo! It's getting awful hot here in the plot. I hope you've been taking notes, because we're gonna delve in to D4's greatest mysteries right now. If you didn't know, this is the spoiler section for a season that doesn't exist. So please, be warned. Let's get into them. Who killed D4? Now, out of all the questions, this one's open for debate. A little bit of everyone, but SWERY has personally taken responsibility for the death of D4, and he's apologized like 1,000 times already, so please forgive him! And if you're still holding out hope that D4 Season 2 is a possibility, and that now that SWERY's out of retirement and he's been making video games, that he and Access Games can make D4 Season 2, I'm gonna shatter that hope right now, because SWERY pretty much fucking hates Access Games and wants nothing to do with them. Play the clip.
Could we do a Kickstarter to save up funds to buy the rights for D4? If we did a Kickstarter like that, it feels like at the very end of it, it would start a court case. No way. He thought you were joking with the D4 question, but I told him, no, they're serious. Everyone's saying, yes, please. No, people really want him to get the rights for D4. Yeah. でも、それってさ、all right, I don't think I could translate that. No, don't. The answer is reasons. Because reasons. We can't. Just think about it. Think about what would happen if we got the funds, even if we got the funds potentially for D4. Kickstarter をやりました。お金が集まりました。We got the money. そのお金を誰に払うんでしょう? Where does that money go? 誰に払うんでしょう? Think about that, and you should be able to figure out the answer. もったいないそんなお金は。It'd be a waste of money in the end. 誰がそのお金をゲットするんですか? Who would benefit from that money? It's my answer.
As I said, it's open to interpretation, but there has been some new information. That is, if you take Deadly Premonition 2's homage or reference to Dark Dreams Don't Die as some sort of a meta commentary on what happened to the series.
Just the usual around here, no need to worry.
The usual?
Yes. A strange person lives upstairs. Every now and then, he makes noise.
What's strange about him?
Several years ago, a woman was murdered upstairs. Her husband still lives there.
Yikes!
He's ex-BPD, and apparently he's still searching for the killer. But it seems like they cut all support for the investigation due to decreased funding. The team on the case wanted to keep working on it, but the suits wouldn't hear of it. A tale as old as time.
So if you take Deadly Premonition 2's commentary as holding any sort of weight, then you'll arrive at the conclusion that it was the lack of funding and terrible fucking timing that killed this franchise. Who is Amanda? Amanda is actually a cat. Now hear me out. Amanda was actually David and Peggy's cat that they owned together. According to Peggy's letters, Amanda was treated like a member of the family. You can also see a photo of Amanda in David's apartment and during a flashback sequence.
Hey, Amanda. Do you want to watch too? We're just at the best bit.
Little...
Now, if you take in mind that both Teddy and David react to Amanda as if she's a cat and not some sort of crazy homeless woman loose in David's apartment, then you can probably arrive at the conclusion that it's just David projecting this visage of a woman upon his cat, Amanda. I see Roland as a spiritual guide for David on David's quest to recover his memories. Roland took the shape of a tall surgeon after the actual surgeon named Roland Walken operated on David's bullet wound on the night of the murder. He appears as a tall man because from David's perspective, which would have been lying down during the operation, the real Roland would seem like he's towering over him. His slow speech pattern might also be David's recollection of Roland's voice overhearing him during the operation.
You should take note of that.
Wait, you don't believe that SWERY would just create some trauma-induced manifestation of a bizarre doctor that only the protagonist can see in one of his video games? Well, he did it in his very next game, The Missing.
Sharks in retrospective. Major emerge.
Who is Dr. August Oldmann? Now, out of all the mysteries this game holds, the identity of Dr. Oldmann is something the game tries to hide the most by obscuring his voice with a distorted quality to it.
How did you come to this?
However, it's in the other little details that give away his identity. First of all, August is wearing the same exact broken watch that David was given by Little Peggy.
Huh? I bought that watch with my first paycheck. You said you'd treasure it forever.
Oh, that's not good enough? Well, if you look into their eyes, you'll notice they have the exact same eye color. No? No, not enough? Okay, I'm gonna go one step further. So, I went into the game's files and I ripped August's texture and David's texture, and look at this horrifying shit. They have the same exact face and the same scar, only August hides his with his hair. In a flashback, Little Peggy also mentions how her father used to be a hockey player, much like David.
Hey, listen to this, David.
My father used to play hockey too when he was younger. Can you imagine that? That stern, scholarly father of mine. Playing hockey.
Also, if you recall the details of the crime scene, only David and Little Peggy's DNA was found on the scene, despite August Oldmann discovering his daughter's body.
The first on the scene was Dr. August Oldmann, the man who raised Little Peggy.
So what does August's identity have to do with the grand story? Pretty much everything. For one, it adds some validity to David's time-traveling ability, and two, it does suggest that there are multiple David Youngs out there. How many? I'm still not sure, but let's dig deeper. What is Dr. Oldmann's goal? David Young's primary motivation in the game is to find a memento which will allow him to see Peggy one more time.
I'm looking for something.
Something?
Yeah, something.
So, what is it?
A lead that will let me meet someone special one more time.
And I believe this memento ends up being the white owl feather Oldmann wears on his jacket. Sometime during Season 2, David would acquire this white owl feather, which would allow him to travel back into time on the day where Peggy almost fell into the icy lake. The day it all began. Little Peggy does mention being rescued by her two wonderful dads.
But my two dads saved me. My two wonderful dads.
But what about this other guy? What happened to dad number 2? I don't know the fate of him, but I can presume he possibly died on that day Peggy fell into the lake, when he tried to rescue her. My only evidence being is that he's never mentioned in Little Peggy's letters, but his fate is unknown. Not to mention that August Oldmann is introduced as Little Peggy's foster father. He adopted her, primarily because the other father out of the picture. Now, as for his goal, we know from a brief mention that he runs a clinical research facility.
The Oldmann Clinical Research Lab?
If you read Little Peggy's letters, she mentions how she had an anemic episode when she was in high school, which caused her to pass out on a bed of clovers, which somehow prevented her death. In a later letter, she also mentions that she has an unknown disease that went into remission around 2004. But in a letter dated October 2010, just a few months shy of her death, she had mentioned how she was taking a bath and the water in the bathtub turned red from blood, and she feared that the disease had come out of remission. Now keep in mind, the first time we are introduced to August, he is holding a book related to bloodborne diseases. Peggy's blood is also drained from her body on the night of the murder. Now I believe in the original timeline, David was looking for a cure for Peggy's disease. In the original timeline, she was going to die of that disease. David, likely in a desperate state of mind, probably gave Peggy some real blood as a means to cure her. He was a deep-cover drug agent after all, and he was likely familiar with the rumors that real blood could give you miracle powers, or at least possibly heal her. So perhaps David gave her real blood. And then something terrible happened. Through a series of flashbacks, it's implied that Little Peggy was the one to shoot David in the head. And in another flashback, Little Peggy is shown with a bullet wound. So maybe it was a mutual shooting in this case. So, original timeline, David survives the gunshot wound and discovers he has miraculous time-traveling powers. And through a series of events, he eventually finds a memento that will take him back to reach Little Peggy one more time. I believe this to be the owl feather. He goes back in time, rescues Little Peggy at the icy lake, and then a new timeline exists, where both David and August Oldmann exist at the same time, and boom, there's multiple Davids. August adopts Little Peggy and then opens the Oldmann Clinical Research Lab in hopes of studying Peggy's bloodborne disease. And possibly, August and Kaysen are working together to discover the source of real blood. And maybe their involvement extends a little deeper. Perhaps that August is the one responsible for all those twisted and burned bodies.
Murders related to real blood.
Now, despite all of August Oldmann's efforts, she ends up dying anyway. August is David, and David is stuck in a perpetual time loop of trying to prevent Little Peggy's death. And unfortunately, he never does, at least in my opinion. Who is D? Now, all the evidence we are given in D4 Season 1 points to Philip Cheney, aka Delta, being D. He is the fourth D after all, and we have no other reason to assume that there's some larger conspiracy behind the scenes. He is also presented as a fearsome foe, as he effortlessly murders Agent Buchanan, and the odds of David's survival at the end of Season 1 aren't looking so good. Remember 2 days later, after the courier vanished, Kaysen mentions how there was a John Doe's body found on the airplane, and they verified it was neither Derek or Zapatero's body. It also wasn't a Jane Doe, meaning that Olivia probably survived it. So who does that leave? David. David dies after his encounter with Delta. But wait, if David dies, doesn't that end D4's story? Not necessarily, because remember, there are multiple Davids, at least we know of August, so maybe he could intervene and prevent his own death. Why did Little Peggy tell David to go look for D? This is something I also had a hard time comprehending. Why would little Peggy tell David to go look for D if she had any inkling that he was a dangerous drug lord of any kind? Maybe it was a case of mistaken memory. I went into the game's files yet again and found all of little Peggy's voice samples. And what I found might shock you.
Don't look for D.
Did you hear it? Don't look for D. And this wasn't just a deleted or unused line. I discovered that this line does appear in the final game, during this flashback during episode 2, when David is remembering little Peggy's murder. You can barely make it out, but she does say, "Don't look for D," although it is not subtitled.
Look for D. Don't look for D.
Peggy did not want David to look for D. Peggy was trying to protect David from being killed by Delta, but due to David's misremembering and overall stubbornness to change the past, he is destined to die. And it's not like David wasn't warned by basically everyone in the game that he can't change the past.
You can't change the past.
You can't change the past. You just have to accept it.
Change the past? Who's gonna believe that bullshit?
And this is why I believe David is stuck in a never-ending time loop, forever fated to die and live and die again. And little Peggy's the constant. She constantly dies all throughout because ultimately he can't change the past. And if you take the scene from Deadly Premonition 2 into context, where Zach mentions how he hears David upstairs making all that noise from falling into his bathtub over and over again, David has been trying over and over again to change the past, and he just can't do it. And that's depressing if you think about it.
Due to his situation, perhaps, he's been making a lot more noise recently, like you just heard.
You never noticed anything, Agent Jones?
Well, I did hear some loud noises every now and then, but I didn't think they were real noises coming from upstairs. I mean, look at him.
Now, I don't think that's how Season 2 would have actually ended, with David stuck in a time loop. I feel SWERY, knowing his record, he likes to end things on a happy note. And the only way out of that perpetual loop of repeating the past is to go towards the future. And David's future is a romance with Olivia.
My apologies, Olivia. You just look so much like an old girlfriend of mine.
What's that supposed to mean?
Just for a second, I actually thought little Peggy had come back to life.
In an interview with SWERY, it is implied that David and Olivia eventually end up together.
I think their relationship will develop in the way that everyone's hoping it will.
And if you listen to Olivia's lines here, she's a future-thinking person.
What if you had the power to go back in time?
I wouldn't want it. The present and the future are all I care about.
If David ends up with Olivia, then he lets go of the past and he creates a brand new future. Happy end. That's where I feel the story was headed. How can you be so certain? The truth is, I don't know for certain. This is my own speculation based on the evidence left within Season 1 and my own piecing together the puzzle pieces within the game's files. Only SWERY and Goda know how Season 2 would have ended up. And unfortunately, we'll never know because SWERY's not going to work with Access Games again. I guess we're all just going to have to accept that you can't change the past. We have to move on to a brand new future. A future without D4 Season 2. Just accept that some dark dreams do die. No, I'm not gonna let go of the past. I can change it. I swear I can. I will never accept D4 Season 2's cancellation. For as long as there's air in these lungs, I'm gonna keep searching for D. And I think I found it. Oh my God, what is this?
Here you go. One corn dog with the rarest Szechuan sauce of all time.
Oh my God. A classic corn dog right out of the picture books. Ooh, I can hardly wait to slide that wiener into my mouth to lick off all that sauce.
Oh dear God, no! This wasn't the D I was looking for!